Okay, MEL, My Embedded Language, Part 2. So I'll assume after the last one I didn't send you running and screaming. So we're going to continue to talk a little bit more about MEL in this particular video, kind of cover a few more concepts. And these concepts do exist with regards to other languages out there. And I just wanted to take a moment to establish something just from the get-go. And that is that if your intent is to become a higher level, sort of maybe a technical director or super technical expert inside of something like Maya, your chances are probably going to be better if you were to switch to something like Python or PyML. The reason for this is something like Python will exist in other software, things like Nuke, 3D Studio Max, etc., etc. The other software also uses Python. PyML might be a good choice because the scripts that you end up writing will end up being significantly shorter. You get a little bit more power, a little bit more punch from it. However, MEL is not a complete waste of time. MEL is good for the average user. It's for someone who doesn't want to dig too deep. They just want to have a basic understanding and be able to go ahead and do some copy-paste and kind of switch around things so that they can get tasks done faster. Another thing with MEL is that it's based on the C language, which means that if you do have any experience with any kind of C languages from before, or you have an interest in maybe one day doing that kind of stuff, it works really well with things like C++ and C#, which is one of the main programming languages inside of Unity. And I found going back and forth between Unity and programming in C# and using MEL that a lot of the methods, the terms, etc. were extremely similar. So it made my life a little bit easier in that kind of respect. So MEL does have its advantages, but again, if you're expecting to be, an extreme level expert inside of Maya and go and work at a studio doing technical direction stuff, Python's probably the better choice. And for that, my recommendation would be to go to something like Code Academy to get the primer course on Python so you can get a handle on it. Okay, so if you haven't left the video now, we'll continue forward and we'll talk about these loops that I wanted to discuss today. There's two main kinds of loops that are used often inside of MEL. And one is the for in loop. So for each item inside of a selection, for example, and then we would perform some kind of action within curly braces. So it starts off with this for, and then the circle brace encasing it, and then each in, and then whatever is there. So these two variables. The way that we use this is usually that's something that has been established outside. Now there's ways of optimizing this information, but we won't get into that until we actually practice the code, which will be in the next video. But this is something that has to be established as a collection of items so that we can then break it apart and do one at a time into this variable. This variable is usually created within the loop. So as we create the loop, this is a new variable that you're establishing to collect one at a time the items that are stored within here. Once you have them, they will then go into this area and a series of actions will be performed on them. Now, what kind of things? Well, we could go ahead and say for each apple in a basket of apples, for example, we could go through each individual apple and we could do something like polish the apple, just as a general concept. So again, we're going through a collection of something that's already there, taking out one at a time and performing a series of actions on it. So that's the for in loop. The other type of loop is more of a counter type, where you don't already have the existing pieces. So what this is a form of counter or timer that you can go through. And what these really mean is this is sort of your starter's point. This is what number you're starting on. You can start from 0, you can start from 1, you can start from 20. It doesn't really matter as long as you establish a starting point for the very first sequence of actions. Then you're creating a sort of counter, something that's going to count the information in one way or a form. In this particular case, it says as long as the value of I is less than 10, then it will continue to run through the loop. And then the last thing is a math operation to that variable. And again, this variable is created within this loop. It's meant to be used within this space to give you something to count with. And right now the plus plus means to increment by 1. And so it's just a math operation, and that math operation can be different. You could tell it to subtract, so you could put minus minus and tell it to subtract by 1. Just the same as you could change this one and say as long as I is equal to 10, continue to do the loop, and it would continue to do it until it would no longer equal to 10. So there's all these different things that you can do within here, but in essence the idea is to be able to create a series of things, give a counter to them, and a circumstance under which that counter operates. Why you would use this kind of loop is if you don't have something to start with already. The other loop is really great for using on selections. You grab the entire selection, you perform a series of actions on each item in the selection. But if you don't have a selection of items at all, let's say I wanted to do something simple like I wanted to create 20 spheres. Well, I would say, okay, I is equal to 0 as my starting point, and then as long as I was less than 20, and then increment by 1 each time you create a sphere. And then it would count up to 20, and I would end up with 20 spheres. So that's really what it's used for, is to go ahead and increment through these things. Now, really what we do need to talk about next, anytime that we're dealing with these wonderful curly braces, is the idea of global versus local values and this thing called scope. So let's talk about that. The global versus local values. One simplification could be something like this. Town gossip. Town gossip is a thing that everybody knows about, and it lasts forever onto perpetuity, and you just really can't escape from it. It's a global value. It exists all over the place. And then within these parentheses, we have Fight Club. And of course, the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club outside of Fight Club. Another analogy could be Vegas. Whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So within these parentheses, whatever happens in there stays in there. So the guys in Fight Club, they know all about the town gossip. That information still passes in through here. The stuff that happens outside the parentheses can go in, but the stuff that's created within the parentheses does not escape those parentheses. So this takes us a little bit further into another term, which is referred to as scope. Now, we're not talking about the mouthwash. We're talking about this term that starts again with these wonderful parentheses. Scope is essentially a sort of lifeline or timeline of the existence of a variable. The variable is, of course, created and then, of course, ceases to exist. Now, this variable existing within that space is a great thing using local values. Global values, again, they exist forever, and they're not really an ideal thing to do. You don't usually want to use global values unless you have a very good reason for it to continue to exist, especially inside of Maya, because they're more prone to things kind of breaking apart. If you make a mistake establishing a global variable, for instance, inside of Maya, you establish it as something that might be like an integer, and then you change your mind, like, oh no, it's supposed to be a float, and you try and change it. Maya will complain and says, oh, you're redeclaring this value that I already know about, and you can't do that, man. Like, I'm not accepting that, dude. Okay? So you have to be careful with that. And the easy way to get away with that is just going ahead and putting parentheses, the beginning and end of any kind of code that you're going to establish, and it becomes local, meaning as soon as you get out of that, that value goes away. Now, this brings up some other curiosities. Let's say that this variable is an international spy. And that international spy has got his creation point, and the point that ultimately he ceases to exist through, old age or other nefarious means. And his goal is to go ahead and get some intel on something. Well, that intel also has its own sort of lifespan. It's got a point where it was created, and perhaps where it self-destructs after this spy has gotten his information. You can have another set of parentheses in here to establish the scope of this new variable. Now, what's great here is that variable doesn't have to cease to exist. The information that it's gained can be placed inside of another variable that exists outside. So you manipulate it, you do what you want to it, math, functions, or etc., and eventually you then copy it into some kind of value that can then carry it outside of that scope. So that's the essence of the idea of global versus local values and scope, and how we're going to want to use them. So in the next video, we're going to sit down inside of Maya, and we're going to create ourselves a couple examples of loops and show you some of the things that are going to potentially go wrong in there. And hopefully this has cleared up a couple of things, so that if you want to go and read more about this stuff, it'll kind of make some sense. Okay, cheers.